Aloha colleagues, welcome to OC 6005, Scope and Methods of Research. The title of this presentation is Literature. This question always comes up in class. Why conduct a literature review? So first off, they can be a source of ideas, research questions, and hunches to explore. Lit reviews also help scholars avoid reinventing the wheel by enabling them to build on what others have done before. Finally, lit reviews help researchers develop an argument for their research project by demonstrating that they are extending existing knowledge by building on what is already out there and filling gaps that exist. One of the questions that comes up a lot, in particular in the organization development and change program, is making the connection between literature reviews and the real world application. So this question usually comes up at the beginning of the semester, and the question usually goes something like this. I'm going to be a consultant when I graduate. I'm not going onto a PhD program after this master's program. Why do I need to learn how to write a literature review? So it's a very good question. I'd like to provide some examples to answer that question. There's a colleague that often tells students how he first learned the practical value of doing literature reviews. When he was a training and development specialist for a private company, his boss at the time often reviewed or required him to review the literature as a means of identifying key strategies or principles to include in their corporate training programs. Second, literature reviews not only provide useful content for the programs, but they also give the training programs a sense of credibility and currency because the trainers were able to cite recent research to support their recommendations for management practice. Another example, we have an alumna who is now a successful consultant, and she often explains how her recommendations to organizations typically begin with a review of the research literature. So it's easy to imagine her presenting recommendations to a client such as, given Computex situation, research suggests that the most successful strategy is likely to be ... I'd like to start now with a discussion on the common problems in literature reviews. This is not my personal list. This is actually documented examples from organizational research on overall themes that scholars see as common issues in literature reviews. So the first issue is the actual search of published literature. So one of the key problems may be that the literature search is not systematic or comprehensive enough. As a result, the literature reviewed may be too narrow, scattered, or out of date. The search may also focus on the wrong sources. For example, relying on textbooks and popular press articles at the expense of scholarly peer-reviewed sources. So the quality of the source is also a major consideration. The next issue is the writing process itself. Lit reviews often lack a clear sense of purpose. Students sometimes mistakenly assume that the goal of the literature review is simply to cite or describe as many sources as possible relevant to the topic, and that is not the purpose of a literature review. Another issue is the he said, she said problem. This is where the writer tells us what each source says, but doesn't convey the relationship among the sources. So it's important to note that it is the writer's job to synthesize or make sense of all the literature. The next issue, not having an audience in mind. A clear audience and objective can help avoid some of the other problems typically associated with a lit review. Some of those we've already gone over. The next issue, writers may assume too much reader familiarity with the literature. So this can be not defining jargon, key terms, constructs, or by not explaining key assumptions. We do sometimes, as academics, make assumptions that our readers are as current on understanding and knowing a certain literature base as we are, and that's often a very dangerous assumption. Another issue is failing to distinguish fact from opinion. We have to be really careful that the information that we present and the conclusions that we draw are based on fact and not someone's opinion. Next, the writer may assert generalizations that are not sufficiently supported by the literature. Sometimes this is where students draw conclusions after reviewing the literature, and it's not a strong argument, and the reader has difficulty making those connections and understanding how the writer actually got from point A to point B. Finally, poor organization or structure that detracts from the effectiveness of the literature reviews. This problem is actually more pervasive than one would think, but poor organization is a major issue in presenting the research in a systematic and logical way. Unfortunately, sometimes students tend to just sprinkle in research studies without really thinking about how they want to present. On the other hand, let's discuss well-written literature reviews. So, a lit review should include the following components. Number one, an introduction that provides an overview of the focus and objectives of the review, along with a thesis statement. Two, a set of themes that categorize and make sense of the sources reviewed and develop the thesis. For example, sources that support a particular position, those opposed, and those scholars offering alternative views. Third, explanation and evaluation of conclusions reached by key sources, an explanation of how they converge and diverge from the conclusions reached by other sources. Conclusions, reasonable speculations, and gaps that emerge after considering the sources as a whole. The lit review introduction and research questions. Like any good research project, a lit review should be guided by a specific objective, or better yet, a question to be answered. You'll hear me refer to this as the research question. In fact, I just posted another video presentation that does go through the steps of developing a really good research question. So most parts of the written literature review, so the introduction, the major headings, and the conclusion can often be derived from this question. So you can derive the set of themes from the key elements of the research question, and then these themes then serve as the major headings for the body of the literature. The largest section of the literature review is the body. Within the discussion of those major themes, the writer should focus on explaining and evaluating conclusions reached by key sources. It's critical that in doing that, the writer integrates and synthesizes rather than just summarizes, and this applies to individual paragraphs as well as the overall lit review. The writer should explain the common or divergent conclusions reached by two or more sources and any issues of concern in evaluation of their claims. So for example, controversial issues or questionable methods. So let's go through an example of synthesizing. So empirical studies of service encounters, relationships, and pseudo-relationships have found that customers are more satisfied with their experience in service relationships than service encounters or pseudo-relationships. And then it goes on specifically, and it quotes other research. So in one sentence, this author has synthesized the main findings from 3 studies, and then in subsequent sentences went on to explain the points of convergence and divergence. So this is a much more effective method than devoting each paragraph to explaining the findings from one study and then leaving it up to the reader to do his or her own synthesis, which unfortunately we see a lot in too many. So this is continuing our discussion on synthesizing. This is a personal pet peeve of mine, but quotations should be used sparingly, but brief excerpts add credibility and clarity when they make a point particularly well. One of the issues that I come across with graduate students is the overuse of quotations, and it's almost to the point where the entire lit review is one big quotation. That is not what we're looking for. Specifically, we're looking for your interpretation of the literature. So I suggest using no more than 2 direct quotations in your entire literature review. So with that in mind, choose wisely on those specific passages that you want to include in your lit review. So just a reminder that synthesizing the literature amounts to constructing an argument about the conclusions reached, questions or concerns about these conclusions, and the gaps that remain. So the features of a good argumentative writing should be prominent. Particularly important is clear paragraph structure. This includes topic sentences that make claims and also indicate the logical flow of the argument. So for example, through connecting phrases such as similarly or in addition, in contrast, the remaining sentences in the paragraph should then clarify, elaborate, and substantiate the topic. So the end result of your lit review should be a coherent set of answers to your research question. So this means that in concluding the review, the reader should summarize the answers to the research question as clearly as the literature allows. So a final note, the writer should pay careful attention to the tone of your writing. The tone should be respectful of the studies that you reviewed, certainly not condescending or dismissive. We do see that mistake a lot with novice writers. So be sure that you are cognizant. It's at this point in the lecture that a student usually raises their hand and says, "This is great information, Dr. Gibson, but how do I get started? I'm not even sure where or how to begin." Well, fear not. We do have a plan of attack for the literature review portion of your research proposal. First off, we're going to look at the grading rubric for the research proposal, specifically the portion that pertains to the lit review. And then I'm going to present a 3-step process for searching and organizing peer-reviewed research articles. And then finally, we'll go through a short exercise to help you learn how to synthesize research articles. If you've already taken a look at the research proposal assignment, it is provided for you on Blackboard. But the grading rubric is broken down by section, and then it's color-coded to help keep those sections together that are related. So there are two sections that pertain to the literature review. The first section pertains to the literature review organization. And I'd like to highlight the elements that are required in the research proposal assignment, and those are listed over here on the right-hand side of your screen. So the lit review should contain your theoretical or conceptual framework, your research question or questions. Yes, you can have more than one. And then your guiding questions or propositions. So those of you from a background of hard science might be wondering where are the hypotheses. And as we have more discussions on action research, we actually will focus more on guiding questions or propositions, so something not quite as specific as a hypothesis. So now that we know what we have to include in our lit review, let's look at the box in the top right-hand corner, and this is the characteristics that demonstrate strong work in the two areas of the lit review that I'm looking at. So specifically for the lit review organization, in order to be eligible to earn 16 to 20 points, which designates strong work, the structure of the lit review is intuitive and sufficiently inclusive of important constructs and variables of the proposed study. So essentially what I'm saying here is that the breadth of the literature that needs to be reviewed is actually included. So it is a comprehensive lit review, and important constructs and variables of the proposed study are included. So I'm looking at the logic of how your lit review is laid out, so the structure, and that it logically flows from portion to portion. The next section of the literature review in general, and also looking at what would designate strong work in that section, the narrative integrates critical and logical details from peer-reviewed research. Each key construct and variable is grounded to the literature, and attention is given to different perspectives. So I'm looking for you to have defined your constructs and made a strong connection to previous research on either that specific construct or constructs that are very closely related. And you'll also notice in the last sentence, attention is given to different perspectives. So I'm also looking for you to present information that may be contradictory to your position, but you need to give credit where credit is due. So overall, there are 40 points possible related to the literature review in your semester-long research proposal process. So this diagram here is a pictorial representation of the three-step process that I recommend that you follow in doing your lit search and constructing your lit review. So step one in the process is essentially a structured search, identification, and filtering of the literature. Step two is deconstruction and structured evaluation of the material. And step three, reconstruction, synthesis, and contribution. Now you're probably sitting there scratching your head saying, I have no idea what that means, Dr. Gibson. So if you look at the bottom row of the arrows, these are the learning tools. So this is essentially what the three-step process is. We're going to conduct a systematically informed search of the literature. When we're through with that, we're going to use a question template to help us deconstruct the information in those articles. And then finally, I'm going to give you a simple metaphor to help you reconstruct the literature and then form the contribution that this literature gives you. So looking at step 1, conduct a systematically informed search. I think it's best to start with an example. So I'm going to utilize the example research question of what motivates gifted students to higher performance at university. So what we first need to do is develop a set of criteria by which to judge the identified literature. So for example, the criteria that I've set out is the research must be peer-reviewed. That is an absolute. There are very few trade magazines or periodicals that are acceptable. One of those would be Harvard Business Review, but there are many other periodicals that are opinion-based and have not gone through the peer-review process and therefore would not be eligible to be utilized in your research project. I'm also looking at articles that focus specifically on university students. So I'm looking at the sample utilized in the research studies. I wanted to concentrate on motivation for studying as well as achievement while at the university. The articles need to not be duplicates held in other databases, and the articles need to be written in English. Unfortunately, I do not speak any other language, so the articles have to be in English. I do recommend that you start by searching the Business Source Complete database, followed by Sage and Emerald in the HPU databases. Those are available through the library tabs on Pipeline. I also recommend that you search Google Scholar as well. Now, what you see on the right-hand side of our screen is a simple spreadsheet in Excel. I've listed here the key search terms that were used, as well as the number of hits that I got in each database, followed by the number of articles that meet my criteria. So unfortunately, there wasn't room for me to put all the databases up there, so I've only presented Business Source Complete and Sage. But what we see here is a total of 17 articles from Business Source Complete that meet our criteria, as well as 23 articles from the Sage database. So we do have a significant amount of articles to read and sift through at this point. The next step in the process is to use a question template for deconstruction. At the beginning of the semester, I gave you access to my personal article review form. It's a lot more general than what I'm presenting here. It's really up to you as far as how you want to deconstruct the information on each individual article. What you want to do to begin this step is to read the articles that meet your desired criteria, and then fill out the question template for each article. I have provided you a file on our Blackboard page that is a blank template of the different questions included in this question template. Here I'm only presenting an example portion, otherwise you wouldn't be able to read the text as it would be rather small. So make sure that you do take a look at that question template, but it is there for you to answer questions about each article. After you have read each article and filled out the question template, and I know that this takes a lot of time. Remember, our search returned 40 articles that met our criteria, so that is a time-consuming part of the phase here. But step 3 is to use a simple metaphor to reconstruct the literature and form a contribution. So remember from the beginning of this presentation that a synthesis transforms data and or concepts, and it takes what's been reported or described in the original studies, and it adds the researcher's interpretation and then recasts it into new findings and interpretations. So the results of the literature review should be treated as a data set that requires further transformation. So in order to help students understand how to put together and group articles, I suggest that you review the contents and organization of your closet or wardrobe, whichever word you like to use, as a means to encourage your ability to reinterpret the information. So you can do this in your imagination, but for example, how could your clothes be organized in your closet or wardrobe? So for example, you might consider arranging all the jackets together on hangers, and then the jeans, sweatshirts, t-shirts, and so forth. And you might also like to keep other items such as shoes together in one place. So the closet or wardrobe itself signifies the literature and prior research on a subject area. So now you're encouraged to develop some selection criteria, such as which clothes you wear the most, or that you would least like to lose, or those that are destined for the donate pile. So when we interpret this metaphor and apply it to academic literature, we can come up with several examples. So relevance to the research question, how robust the original data was in the study, how current the research is, and also looking at the cultural context of the research studies. So at this stage, the selection criteria are not arbitrarily created, but can be defended and justified. So you have to be able to explain why you chose the categories that you did, or why you chose the different groupings of articles that you did. So once your criteria is identified, the criteria for selection must be rigorously applied. So what do I even mean by that? So the garments selected will remain in their subcategories. So something along the lines of all the shirts, all the jeans, etc., etc., until they are then resorted into as many different new categories as possible. So for clothing, new categories might be by color, occasion for wear, the style, type of fabric, season or garment care, which essentially mimics the deconstruction process in the literature review. So your final step is to create new categories that make for a coherent categorization that includes all the remaining clothes. So this could arise, for example, by creating outfits that work together or will be appropriate for particular situations, such as working in an office or going to a party. So when you write your reviews, these new categories or concepts should relate to your research. Whew, so we made it through the three-step process. I know that it's a lot of information. You can pick and choose what elements of that process you would like to use. I know everyone has their own way of writing. I personally utilize a process very similar to this one, but I do want you to keep in mind that the construction of your lit review as well as the organization is extremely important, and it is something that I will be grading on. So I would like you to take this exercise that we're going to do here in a few minutes quite seriously. So what I've done is I've provided you with a brief exercise for you to practice synthesizing some research. So on our Blackboard page for this week, there's a file entitled Literature Review Experiential Exercise. And in this file are the abstracts of 4 research articles, all on a similar set of topics. So your goal is to use the principles that we've discussed in this presentation to write a brief lit review. So only about 2 to 4 paragraphs. In particular, I'd like you to focus on incorporating key elements outlined in this lecture and synthesizing the findings of the 4 articles. So also assume that your audience is the manager of corporate training who has asked you to find out what the research says about patterns of upward influence. So go ahead and pause this presentation now, work on your lit review, and then once you're finished writing your 2 to 4 paragraphs, go ahead and continue watching this presentation after you've finished. I have provided you a solution to the lit review exercise. So the file lit review exercise solution, it is on this week's Blackboard page. So the file provides 2 examples of short lit reviews based on the 4 abstracts that you read and reviewed. Read through each version. They are in a Word file, so you can use your mouse to scroll over each comment on the right, and it will point to exactly where in the document the comment is related to. Did you identify areas that we discussed in the presentation? How did your own writing compare to those examples? Are there any areas that you can improve on? And do you have any questions for me? I'm happy to help. I know that this can be an intimidating process, but my job is to help guide you through it. So please make sure that if you have questions that you are contacting me as soon as possible. Have a great week and get working on those